I'm delighted to co-sponsor this talk with the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics, with Jennifer Garcia here as a representative. We are delighted to have as our guest today Leopoldo Ferguson, who is Professor of Economics at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. And his talk is going to be on a really technically sounding but fascinating subject nonetheless. High-powered incentives with elite institutions, the case of the Colombian false positives. And of course that will become, the meaning of this will become more evident to many of you who may not know so. Leopoldo Ferguson is an assistant professor of economics at Los Andes, and his research interests are in political economy, development economics, and economic history. Man after my heart. Among other topics, he has studied the political economy of the determination of property rights and in institutions in rural areas. The role of mass media in countering the influence of special interest groups, the unintended negative consequences of media exposure of corrupt politicians in weakly institutionalized societies, make that clear too, and the implications of democratization for violent conflict. Ferguson holds a PhD in economics from MIT. And he has a number of publications. You can, of course, Google him if you wish. Some of them are not really related to, they're all interesting. They're not related to this particular subject.
Not everything is interesting.
No. That's not what I meant. But in any case, I give you Leopoldo Ferguson.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Francisco, and thank you very much, Jennifer, for the invitation. It has been very nice to spend this time here. We had already a very productive morning in a very nice workshop that Jennifer put together, and I'm very excited to be presenting this here, so it's really a pleasure to be here. I had never been to Madison, and it's lovely. They tell me that it's like this for the entire year, so it's really, really nice. Let me just start by telling you briefly what this is about and why I chose this topic. As Francisco said, this sounds like a technical topic, but it actually is not. Actually, I'm going to frame it very much as an economist. But the reason I chose to talk about this is because I think it's of interest to other disciplines, and I think one of the interesting things of area studies in general, and surely I think it's the case in LASIS, is that there are topics that benefit greatly from interdisciplinary work. So I think that although I'm going to see it as an economist, this is something that is probably relevant for other disciplines as well. This is joint work with Carlos Moglu at MIT, James Robinson at Harvard, and Juan Vargas, who is a colleague in Colombia, in the Universidad del Rosario, Los Andes, as Francisco told you. Can you all hear me well? Do I have to wear the microphone? It's fine? Okay, good. So let me start by motivating the whole analysis. There's a basic idea that stems from principal-agent analysis, which is that high-powered incentives, meaning giving bonuses for working, for producing output, is a useful way to increase non-contractable effort. If you're hired by an employer to sell ice cream, you cannot really sign a contract in which you say, clause number 1, you are going to work really hard. Or you could actually write down that clause, but it's really non-enforceable. You can always say, oh, I work really hard. So a way to get around that problem is I'm going to give you a bonus if you sell more ice creams. And that incentivizes the agent to work really hard. That's what I mean by high-powered incentives. That's what I mean by the fact that principal-agent analysis says that this is a good measure or a way to increase non-contractable effort. However, it has long been known by theorists in this area, but that in many circumstances this is not optimal. So one example where this is not optimal is where you have multiple tasks and incentives can only be given on something that is easily measured. So for example, in Universidad de los Andes right now, which is a university that has transformed itself into a research university, it has transformed itself into a research university for many reasons, but one of them is that there are explicit incentives when you are actually good at research and you publish and so on. You get incentives, you get promoted, you get bonuses and so on. And now there is this concern that are we not teaching very well? Now we are bad teachers because measuring teaching is really hard. Are you a good teacher? That's a really hard thing to measure. You can always ask the students, but the students, I don't know, perception surveys are also complicated. So that could be a context in which if you provide too strong incentives for research, people become lousy professors and you want them to do both tasks. So it's not always optimal to provide high-powered incentives. That's one example. Another perhaps more obvious example is this simple rule. One of the first rules of pay for performance, Candice Prendergast says here, is that you never pay for performance in the context where the person who cures the problem is also the person who diagnoses the problem. Are you teaching well? Yes, I'm teaching great. Okay, here's your bonus, right? So these are just like as a way of motivation to what I'm going to get to. A couple of examples in real life about this. And that's one thing that I want to say about the literature. I think we're going to contribute here to the literature by providing systematic evidence on something on which we basically have a lot of very telling examples, but as far as we know, no systematic evidence. So here's one example from George Bush's No Child Left Behind policy that gives incentives to teachers. Say that teachers get a bonus if 40% of the students succeed at reading a basic reading test. What happened after that is that teachers only focused on the students who were around the cutoff. If you were a good enough student that you were going to pass the exam anyways, why should I spend time with you? And if you are a lost cause, I'm not going to spend time with you either. So they focused on the cutoff, on students near the cutoff, and you also wanted them to look at the other students. Sorry, this thing jumped to the end. Sorry. Okay, another problem could be gaming. This first one is called substitution. Another one could be gaming. In the 1980s, Sears introduced pay for performance for its auto mechanics, and you can imagine what happened. This happens even if there is no pay for performance for auto mechanics. You bring in your car and it ends up having everything wrong. You thought that only one light was wrong, everything was wrong. So there could be gaming. So, I mean, there are all these sorts of problems, and we're going to focus on the simplest kind of predictions from the theory of when cheating is more likely. If an agent that is facing pay for performance can cheat, he can choose between the bad effort, which is pretending to be doing a hard work, or good effort, which is truly working hard. And we're going to focus on the two simplest predictions of when is bad effort more likely. Bad effort is more likely if you face strong incentives, if you really have a strong bonus if you perform well, or if it is easy to falsify, if it's easy to cheat and not being caught by cheating. So we're going to look at these two basic predictions of this literature. And in the case of one dysfunctional behavioral response by the Colombian army to the introduction of high-powered incentives. So this is when I said that I think this is something that is not only important for economists, is because this really is a case in which, as some of you may be familiar with, Colombia 10 years ago was in the context of a very long internal conflict, facing really hard times in the sense that the guerrilla were pretty strong. And Álvaro Uribe, president for 2 consecutive terms, was elected on a platform of combating the guerrilla members and strengthening the state, which was something that was probably very important to do. But we have a bunch of contradictions in Colombia where we have a strong state in several dimensions, a relatively stable institutional environment in several dimensions, but also a weak institutional environment in many others. And how do you strengthen a state in a context where a bunch of institutions are weak? That's kind of the bigger question. The narrow question, which is the one that I framed right here, is when you introduce high-powered incentives in this context of the Colombian army, what things could go wrong. So let me give you the context to explain what I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about false positives, which is a term that refers to the arbitrary execution of civilians who were killed by the armed forces, and the armed forces try to portray these victims as guerrilla members or as paramilitary members. Mostly as guerrilla members, as you will see, but also as paramilitary members. In any case, as members of illegal armed groups. But they were discovered that this was actually a setup. So I think this is the ugliest collage I've ever made in my life. And believe me, I took off the ugliest part of the pictures. The point of this slide is to show you why we know that these are false positives, that these were actually civilians. So, for example, the picture on the left, the top, in the top on the left, is showing, I have no idea about weapons, but supposedly the way that he's holding the arm, this weapon is completely anti-technical. It's something that you would never hold it like that. So they basically kill the guy and they put him in a position as if he was holding that gun, but it's very unlikely he will be holding the gun that way. This guy is holding some grenades in his pockets in a completely dangerous way. They can easily fall and he would be killed. So he would never be holding those grenades in that way. So it's clearly a setup after the civilian was killed. They made a setup to make him look as if he was a combatant.
But these are being carried out by members of the armed forces, right?
Yes.
I mean, don't they know how to carry a grenade? When
You would expect. You would expect. Yeah. Absolutely, you would expect. Yeah. But they were careless. They were careless probably because they thought that that was good enough to be able to get away with it.
But could it also be that indeed they were like guerrilla members and somehow, but they wanted to make it look even better, and somehow they spiced it up, adding more grenades.
It could be. I mean, and there could be.
So you knew that the guy was. It's like say you know the true state of the world, but somehow you cannot prove it. So you think you're almighty. You kill the guy and then you just frame him. But you're sure that they
Right. It could be, and our data could have some biases. I'm going to talk about how we measure false positives and why we think we're confident that we shouldn't have big biases in this. But I mean, it's something that it's supposed to go unnoticed, so it's going to be a problem. But these are cases in which the judges feel that there's sufficiently strong evidence that these guys actually were civilians. And then also this is coupled with evidence from victims, family members, and so on. And finally, this other guy, this guy has his right boot on the left foot and the left boot on the right foot. Plus, he's holding his, I don't know, this round or cartridge, I don't know how you say that, inside the boot, which is also a very, supposedly a place you wouldn't hold the cartridge. So they were discovered, and this is a phenomenon that has existed for a long time. But it became much more common in the mid-2000s, with a big surge around 2005, 6, or 7. Less than 14% of all false positives that we count, I will tell you about our data set later, occurred before 2002, whereas 44% occurred between 2006 and 2007. And there was a substantial fall by late 2008. Here's the figure of false positives. I will explain you later how we compute this. The solid line is the number of killings, and the dashed line is the number of cases, because in a single case you could kill more than one alleged guerrilla member or paramilitary member. And we see what I was describing earlier. There's basically, it's been something that has been around for a long time, but it was low levels for much of the time, and then it increased strongly. Well, it really started increasing in 2002, but there was a strong increase around 2005, and then it fell in late 2008. Now, one reaction could be, well, this is just collateral damage. When you are fighting the guerrilla, I mean, war is ugly, you end up killing civilians. So it's not really the introduction of any high-powered incentives, performance pay, or any expectation that you were going to do better if you killed more guerrilla members. It just has to do with the fact that if you are fighting the guerrilla harder, you are going to have more collateral damage. But if you look at true positives, the killings of people that we know were guerrilla members, actually it peaks much before. It's not just mimicking the figure from the false positives. So I'm going to get to this alternative explanation in more detail later, but at least the raw data doesn't suggest that this is just collateral damage.
Can I ask a question about that? So does that imply they're actually substituting away from going after guerrillas?
Yes. So this does suggest that they are, look at the peak here is around 2005, and it seems that they started going down in terms of killings of guerrilla members and up in false positives. So it could be substitution. And there are reasons to think, and there is like anecdotal evidence suggesting that in some places they had to do that, in the sense that the guerrilla had already been eradicated for a given municipality, say, but they were still being pushed for results. So what did they do? Well, they killed civilians and present them as guerrilla members. So in some places there could have been substitution. In other places, it could not. It is not necessarily substitution, but it's just that you are trying to do both kinds of efforts, the good effort and the bad effort at the same time. Yeah.
I think you may have said this before, but what are the lines here that represent changes in presidential?
There was an election in 2002. That was when Álvaro Uribe was elected. He was elected on this platform of anti-guerrilla, and really we have to fight them because the president before him, from 1998 to 2002, President Pastrana, had attempted some peace dealings that went terribly wrong. Basically, the guerrilla took advantage of those peace dealings to strengthen itself, and they really didn't take it seriously. So the majority of the population in Colombia were really disappointed about the peace talks and felt that we really have to start a military offensive against the guerrilla. So that started in 2002. Uribe got elected then. Then in 2006, we had no re-election, but he changed the constitution to be able to re-elect himself. And he was re-elected from 2006 to 2010. In 2010, he was going to give it another try and try to change the constitution again. But the Constitutional Court ruled that modification out, and so he was ousted. And Juan Manuel Santos, the current president, was elected, basically on a platform proposing to continue with Uribe's policies, although he went on another direction once elected, and now the main member of the opposition is actually Uribe. But that's kind of the time. 1998, a president who tried to strike deals with the guerrilla went out. 2002, Uribe fighting the guerrilla members strongly, and 2 periods until 2010, and from 2010 onwards, Santos. Okay.
And high power incentives were present all the time.
I'm going to talk about that. It's going to be hard. Much of this, let me get to it. So the timing of these searching false positives has to do with the issue of a specific set of documents that is correlated with these incentives. So in 2005, there was an army directive, which was a secret army directive. It was not really secret. I have it here, okay, because it was leaked by the press, and it is an army directive with a ministerial policy to develop criteria to pay for rewards for the capture or killing in combat of members of the guerrilla. So that's one form of incentives. There was also a presidential decree a bit later, which is called the BOINA, which is just the acronym for what they were looking for, in which the president was also given rewards for being able to kill major guerrilla members. So those are two direct measures providing incentives to kill guerrilla members. Not only to kill guerrilla members, but for seizing weapons, sharing information, etc. Some of the features of these things, in particular the first directive, is that military personnel were not explicitly excluded from the possibility of getting the rewards. These were rewards that were meant for an arbitrary person. So it could be a civilian that helped the army to get to one main leader, or it could be actually a soldier who did a good job to be able to get to the leader, or a colonel, or whatever. There was a fixed pot for the main guerrilla leaders, which was, you know, if you could get this guy Cano, one of the main guys, you would get, if you help us with the effective information to get him, you'll get this amount of money and so forth. But for the lower ranks, there was no explicit rule. So there was kind of a strong incentive to try to go and get money and kill them and then get some money, which was unspecified. In terms of how easy it was to cheat, the operation that led to the reward didn't have to be authorized by ex ante by a superior officer, and moreover, posterior intelligence could justify the killings that you had already committed. So you could actually, it was the problem of the same person who is curing the problem is diagnosing it. So, oh, I killed, oh, this is a guerrilla member, right? And you could justify it with posterior intelligence. So you could make it up, basically. Now, was this all that was around? Were these the incentives? We don't know, because we know about this secret directive, but there was probably another directive the year before. There was another one modifying this one the year after. What we do know is that there was a general movement towards incentivizing the army in explicit ways for killing guerrilla members. And this didn't include only these formal incentives that I just talked about. It also included, now we know after the trials, it also included some informal and regulated incentives, among which one that was particularly telling and that was mentioned by UN Special Rapporteur Philip Alston, who went to investigate this issue after a scandal broke out, which is that soldiers were granted days of vacation. So a different counts on this, but some people say if you were able to kill one guerrilla member, you would get 10 days off for each guerrilla member that you were able to kill. And so this is one soldier stating that when important holidays approached, you knew that you could try to earn vacation time. Yeah.
What about just plain captures without killing?
So that was one of the changes that was emphasized. So killings were really emphasized, not only in the directive, but also in the wording of the military members and the higher ranks, and even the president was pushing for, we want bajas, we want killings. And then there were some intercepted communications in which we have, for example, one infamous army general saying, I want to see liters of blood pouring in this region. I want to see killings. So captures is an important thing when they try to solve the problem. So I'm going to get to captures in a second.
So are they just grabbing people off the street, or are they like sympathizers? I mean, I can imagine it's sort of easier to justify in your mind if it's somebody that you think is still sympathizing
Yeah.
with your movements.
There were very different kinds. There were many different kinds of killings, which include both, and some are outrageous. Or for example, there was a logic of, well, we're going to kill, for example, the mentally disabled and things like that. And so they would take soldiers, and they would ask soldiers who come from such municipality, okay, in your municipality, who's the guy who has some disability? Who's the guy who has who is like a undisciplined guy who is always with trouble with the law or whatever, but not necessarily a guerrilla member, just a guy who's a troublemaker. And they would get some of those names, and they would go and feel that that's justified in that sense. That kind of thing, even more than just killing a sympathizer, right? Because if it's a sympathizer, well, maybe he's a guerrilla member. He was just not killing. He was just not killed in combat. So it's a violation of international humanitarian law, but it's still a guerrilla member. So, but the other logic of feeling justified because, oh, we're killing, just like there's like this very perverse social cleansing logic that also happened when the killings took place. So in the end, there was a full incentive scheme that included money, vacations, and promotions that we know that was put in place during Uribe's administration, that we don't know exactly when it happened, that we know that probably a couple of years into his presidency, he was really pushing strong for this, but we don't know exactly the timing which we, as like the members of the army, really felt were going to be paid off for killing more guerrilla members. So that's something that we're going to try to deal with in the empirical strategy. But we know that there was a full incentive scheme put in place, and that the army members felt if we kill people, we're going to get bonuses and some kind of rewards. Now, something important I want to emphasize is that there are career concerns here, in the sense that these incentives that were put in place are more likely to affect those people who still have room to go up to the military level. Because one of the main things that I didn't mention before is that this amount of guerrilla members that you kill was also something that the members of the military felt is going to be very important when the higher ranks review you and are thinking of promoting you into a general from being a colonel, say, which is actually the most important kind of step in the sense that it's the hardest to get. And this is also important because during the 2000s, the Colombian army had a really unprecedented expansion of the military forces because it was doing this military effort to fight the guerrilla. I have here some theories of how the army increased, and this also included the creation of new brigades. But of course, you can increase the size of the army really quickly, but it's not that you can produce generals overnight. It takes a time, you have to stay several years as a colonel and so on. And therefore, the army decided to appoint colonels to command brigades, which was something that was previously only saved for generals, commanding brigades. So that's something that we're going to exploit as well. The fact that some commanders of the brigades still have room to go up in the ladder, and some don't. Now, another thing, or another reason that we know that these incentives were important has to do with what the government did when a scandal broke out, because it was discovered that in a municipality near Bogota, some guys were recruited with promises of employment, taking 500 kilometers north and killed. And this was found out probably because they were too silly to do it in Bogota, in a place where you are more likely to find out that somewhere distant in the rural areas. And therefore, when this was known, there was a huge media scandal, a political scandal, and so on. And the government started taking measures, and the measures including directives that kind of removed some of these incentives. So, for example, there were directives that changed the one that I showed you before in the terms of explicitly excluding the payment of rewards to army members, including rewards for demobilizations and for captures, and not just for killings, and saying that actually demobilizations and captures were preferred to killings. Required the operations to have the support of prior intelligence, and including more control from the commander saying that he authorized the operation. And also they took other measures such as disciplinary sanctions on the ones who were involved, and requiring deaths in combat to be first investigated, that is, in the scene of the killing, to be first investigated by the judicial police. And they also created a special unit in the Office of the Attorney General, which is called the Fiscalía in Colombia, to deal with these kind of problems and to try to prosecute them. So, this is the context, and then just let me remind you of our two basic predictions. The stronger are the incentives for a given ability to cheat, to falsify, the greater should be the bad effort. In our model, bad effort are false positives. We're going to test this by looking at the fact that false positives should be more likely in colonel-led brigades, because they should have higher incentives in the sense that, stronger incentives in the sense that they still have room to go up the ladder of hierarchy. Second, for a given incentive scheme, maintaining that power of incentives constant, the easier it is to falsify, the greater is the bad effort. And how are we going to measure the easiness to falsify? We're going to look at municipalities with weaker judicial institutions, which are places where you think, in general, that you can get away with killing people. So we're going to construct a measure of how efficient the judicial system is at the local level at dealing with murders and other kinds of crimes against life. And we're going to think that in those places, soldiers were probably thinking, okay, here it's a place where I can easily get away with killing people, and nobody ever finds out what really went on.
But people, military people are not subject to like normal rules, right? So what's the relevant?
That's an interesting thing, yeah.
What's the relevant